Belgium is essentially split in half, with Dutch speakers in the north and French speakers in the south. Well, there are German speakers in the east, but we'll just ignore them for now. Anyway, I'm in Brussels, which is a primarily French-speaking city in the middle of the Dutch-speaking north. So sort of like West Berlin in a way. But it hasn't always been like this, and it was once, in fact, a Dutch-speaking city. The Francification of Brussels can probably be traced back to the 15th century when Burgundy took it. But French-speaking then was minimal, but it did slowly creep its way in when the Habsburgs took control of the city. However, real change only came about after the 80 Years' War. At the end of the wars, the Low Countries were essentially split in half, with Belgium remaining under Habsburg control, but the Netherlands becoming an independent country. So many Dutch speakers here fled over to Netherlands, especially the middle class and administrators. In fact, tens of thousands of Dutch speakers fled over to the Netherlands, and during the Reformation, many churches began favouring doing services in French or Spanish because they saw Dutch as a little bit too Protestant. And when the Austrians took over in the 18th century, they continued these policies. But more importantly, by the 18th century, Dutch power had waned. French, meanwhile, continued to grow in power, and French culture in the way of literature and plays began to pour across the border. So particularly amongst the middle class and bourgeois in Brussels, they began to favour using French. But although French was increasing, by 1780 only around 15% of the population here in Brussels spoke it. This French-speaking minority was particularly affluent, and the Dutch majority were getting poorer and poorer. Then in 1794 the French invaded and of course stamped out Dutch from all official positions. Some say that the Dutch opposition to the French during this time were the predecessors of the Flemish movement, but in 1815, when Napoleon was defeated, Belgium was joined with Holland to form the United Provinces. With the Dutch in control of Brussels, of course, Dutch became the dominant language, but in 1830 the Belgian Revolution ended Dutch rule and caused quite a bit of turmoil within Brussels, as many French immigrants flocked to the new capital city. So again, French began to be seen as the language of the cultural and the elite, whereas Dutch was seen as the language of the poor. And it wasn't uncommon for Dutch-speaking grandparents to have French-speaking grandchildren in the 19th century. So in short, French was seen as a very prestigious language, and many people in Belgium just began to speak it to appear cultural in a way. But with this sort of mindset, all the administrators and stuff like that began speaking French, and it filtered down into the school systems. But in the early 20th century, the Dutch speakers began to fight back. Initially, they hoped that they could turn Belgium into a bilingual country, but this was rejected. So instead, they turned to trying to end French expansion and stopping the French speakers from holding most of the government positions. And at this, they were successful, because in the 1960s, they boycotted some census, and they also protested in the streets of Brussels, and this forced the government to create a language border. Although Brussels wasn't included in the Dutch-speaking region, some of the surrounding French-speaking regions were, so the children there would have to go to Dutch schools and learn Dutch. So many Francophone interest groups began to protest this, saying that it was undemocratic, but the French speakers still held a lot of power. For instance, some seats in the Brussels Parliament were reserved for Dutch speakers, but French-speaking false Flemish, as they were called, were able to sort of lie their way into getting those seats. However, the argument continues until this day, and it doesn't look likely to be sorted anytime soon. But for Brussels, at least, it is now very much a bilingual city.